Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. Hi, I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for joining today. And I need to let you know about a brand new thing on the internet. You're going to love it. Well, maybe not love it. You might like it. It's a Facebook group for 10-Minute Murder. But Joe, don't you already have a... Yes, I have a Facebook page for 10-Minute Murder already. This one's a Facebook group. There's a big difference. My plan is to make the page solely dedicated to this podcast. Everything you see and hear on this podcast, you can find it on the Facebook page for 10-Minute Murder. Now, the group I look at as more of like a discussion. It doesn't have to be related to this podcast necessarily. It can be breaking news in the world of true crime. It can be where we're discussing cases that you can hear on this podcast. But there, it's more of a discussion type of thing, and you can post things as well. It doesn't have to be me all the time. But I hope for that to be eventually turn into just a big discussion page about the world of true crime. All right, now here comes the confusing part. How to tell you how to get to the group. I don't really know. I wish I was more prepared at this point, but I'm not. But here's what I can tell you. If you go to the 10-Minute Murder Facebook page, I put a link there that takes you to the group. And to get to the page, you just type in 10-Minute Murder into the search bar and it's going to pop up. It might pop up the group too. I don't really know how it works. But as far as at this moment, that's the quickest way I can tell you how to get there. If this is your first time listening to 10-Minute Murder, please subscribe now so that you can catch up on all of the back episodes. It's 300 plus at this point. You can catch up on all those episodes, plus never miss any new ones. Connect with me on social media, see the visuals that we're talking about here in the podcast. And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and review at any place that's possible. Your positive feedback is helpful and it's very much appreciated. Go to 10minutemurder.com for all things related to 10-Minute Murder. Now to today's story. After being sentenced to death 9 times over, one death sentence for each of his 9 confirmed victims, Henry Louis Wallace addressed the families of his victims in a statement. He told them, quote, "None of these women, none of your daughters, mothers, sisters, or family members in any way deserved what they got. They did nothing to me that warranted their death." In one short statement, Henry did what so many killers failed to do over the course of their entire lives, acknowledging that each of his victims had been a human with a complex life of their own, and that none of them had deserved to be hurt by him. As a statement, it would have been powerful, except for that Henry had not only deliberately hurt these women, but brutally assaulted and murdered them. But that statement wasn't the only way in which Henry did not fit the media image of a serial killer. According to FBI profilers, most serial killers are white men who don't know their victims. Henry was a black man, and he had a personal connection to each and every single person he killed. With a clear link between Henry and his victims, it seems that the breadcrumbs would lead directly back to him. So how did he avoid capture long enough to murder so many people? And why did he do it? On the surface level, it seems as if the motive was money. Each of Henry's victims was robbed after their death, and he used that money to fuel one of his greatest vices, his addiction to crack. However, the motive ran much deeper than that. In reality, Henry attacked his victims because of his sexual desires, his need to have control, and the ability to inflict fear. This characteristic is very similar to fellow serial killers like Ted Bundy. Getting money to fuel his addiction was a bonus, but it wasn't why he killed. Born in South Carolina, Henry had been well-liked and popular in high school. Popular to the point where nobody laughed when a 6-foot-tall teenager signed up to be the only guy on the school's cheerleading squad. It's more common now, but in the early 1980s, that's basically social suicide. College wasn't for him. He ended up working at a local radio station, calling himself the Night Rider, earning himself praise for his smooth voice and relaxed manner. Henry liked working in radio, and he could have been happy there. But one day he was caught stealing a bunch of CDs and was immediately fired. With no job and no plans, Henry joined the Navy in 1985. While he was there, he got married, made friends, and started to work his way up through the ranks. His performance as a sailor was almost flawless, but the end of his career was undignified. He was caught attempting to commit burglary close to the naval base and then discharged from service. It was only because of his immaculate performance during his time as a sailor that he avoided being stamped as a dishonorable discharge. After 8 years, Henry was trying to hold down a steady job with little success, and also making an attempt to remember how to be a civilian. But he was struggling with these things, and his wife told him that she wanted to leave him. With no money and few options, Henry moved back home to Charlotte, North Carolina, where his family lived. It felt like he was right back where he started, just a teenage boy who had thrown away his job working in late-night radio. Although Henry had certainly dabbled in drugs before, his true addiction to substances began around this time. His life was unstable and his future was uncertain, but when he was using crack cocaine, he felt good. Crack became an expensive emotional crutch for Henry, and to support it, he got a job as a manager at a Taco Bell restaurant. He also attempted to move on from his ex-wife, finding love again, and he met a lady named Sadie McKnight, who quickly became his girlfriend. The killings began in June 1992, when a young black woman, Caroline Love, vanished seemingly into thin air. Caroline was labeled as a missing person until 2 years later, when her remains were found. Her roommate, Sadie McKnight, the same Sadie who had recently begun dating Henry and had given him a key to the apartment that she shared with Caroline, had no idea what happened to her friend. With nobody else to share her apartment with, Sadie moved in with Henry, taking their relationship to the next level. In February 1993, Shauna Hawk answered a knock on the door and found that the manager of the Taco Bell restaurant where she worked was standing at her doorstep. She was surprised to see him, but she liked Henry and didn't feel uncomfortable around him. She invited him in without hesitation, and the two of them chatted for nearly an hour. 8 months after Caroline's disappearance, Shauna was found dead in her own house. Her boyfriend found her in a bathtub full of water, naked, beaten, and bruised around her head. But the autopsy determined that despite being beaten and submerged in water, Shauna's cause of death was strangulation. She had also been sexually assaulted, and money had been taken from her wallet. When another young woman, Audrey Spain, was found naked and strangled to death in East Charlotte, the media began referring to the killer as the Charlotte Strangler. Months apart, more bodies were found. There were common threads. All the murders were within the same general radius of East Charlotte. All the victims were black, and every one of them had been strangled, even for victims like Michelle Stinson, where Henry stabbed her to death and then strangled her after the fact. Still, Henry was evading suspicion and capture. It was mid-March of 1994 when Henry's carefully constructed plan to avoid capture began to fall apart. He was out of control. He couldn't stop. If a screw had been loose in his head, it had somehow fallen out of whatever it was holding together. He needed the robberies to fund his drug habit, and he needed the sexual assault and violence to scratch the itch inside of him. Up until this point, he'd been cautious at every scene, cleaning away fingerprints and DNA evidence and making sure that he waited until things quieted down to kill again. Now he was in a state of gluttony, riding the constant high of murder. He began to get sloppy. For want of a better term, he went on a killing binge. Between the 9th and the 11th of March, Henry committed 3 separate murders, 1 per day. It was a massive change from the several month-long gaps he'd been deliberately leaving in the past. The public, terrified. Police investigators, frustrated. Suddenly, there was a light bulb moment in the room. They had cross-referenced the names of the acquaintances with the names of the victims and noticed that even though the victims weren't acquainted with each other at all, there was one name that kept popping up, a man that they knew in some way: Henry Louis Wallace. Valencia Jumper had been friends with Henry's sister, and Betty Balcom had been friends with his girlfriend Sadie. Caroline Love had been actually Sadie's roommate at the time of her disappearance, and Henry managed the Taco Bell restaurant where the 2 victims, Audrey and Shauna, worked. Over and over, Henry Wallace, Henry Wallace, Henry Wallace. How had they missed this? The police department was left desperately trying to justify why it had taken them so long to figure out the link between all of these missing women. They faced a serious accusation from the public that they had neglected the case because of Henry's victims. They were black. The argument that they gave was they had no experience with serial killers, and prior to Henry's last killing spree, the FBI had refused to help them investigate due to the belief that the killings were not related. During his interview, Henry was forthcoming with information, readily walking them through each of the murders he committed. He forced them to step into his shoes, reliving from his perspective the crime in grotesque detail. The investigators were shocked by the contrast between his demeanor and what he was telling them, and at one point, one of the investigators asked Henry if he believed he could have schizophrenia, because he didn't seem to be a bad guy. Henry was quick to reply, saying, "No, there's only one Henry, a bad Henry." When you find out that a loved one is a killer, you remember every detail of your relationship with them in a new light. For Henry's girlfriend, Sadie, this new lens led to a grim realization. Throughout their entire relationship, he'd been giving her constant gifts of jewelry, but she had no idea where he got it from. Now she knew, but she wished that she didn't. This whole time, Sadie had been wearing the jewelry of at least 9 murdered women.